So asking when Judaism begins is a really interesting question, partially because it's actually hard to date the books of the Bible, and partially because depending who you ask, the beginnings of the Bible, a lot of it feels like mythology, and so shouldn't necessarily be taken as history. But historiographically, the beginnings of Judaism start with Abraham, God saying to Abraham, Lech Lecha, go forth, and setting a covenant with Abraham. Although there are other Jews who would interpret that Judaism actually begins later, that with Abraham, it's really about family and one generation following another. And it's only with the Exodus from Egypt and then the giving of the law at Sinai that Judaism really becomes a religion of something bigger than a family that really consists of a peoplehood and a larger understanding of what's going on. I think it's so hard to pin down God to any one thing. There are, of course, a lot of different traditions that come out of Judaism that talk about God, but fundamentally, God is not human, and God is, to a very large degree, beyond our understanding. And having said that, there are different kinds of Jews that understand the nature of God differently, but I think there are a couple of basic things that all Jews can agree on. And one is, if there is a God, there is only one. So there are some Jews who are atheist or agnostic. Judaism as a religion believes in a monotheism, so there is one God, and the nature of that God is as a creator. And there are different metaphors that we use for God. God as a father, God as a shepherd, God as a judge, God as merciful, and there are all of these different names and references to God. But to a large degree, I think that beyond the oneness of God, Judaism allows people to have an individual relationship and an individual interpretation of what they see as the divine. A lot of different beliefs. Because Judaism is such an old religion, it's subject to a lot of interpretation, and based on what's happening historically, sometimes beliefs change. So the question of what happens after someone dies is a really complicated one that Judaism doesn't have one answer to. Judaism fundamentally focuses on this life and having the best world that we can. Having said that, there is a concept of something called Olam Haba, which is the world to come. And there are two interpretations of that. One is the place that you go after you die, which is, I don't know, sort of ambiguous. The other is an idea of what happens after the Mashiach, the Messiah, comes, or after a messianic era, in which case the world is perfected and the world that we live in feels like the Garden of Eden over again. And that's also seen as Olam Haba, and sometimes those two concepts are conflated. And so it can go both ways, but fundamentally this notion of what happens after we die, the answer is the Jews don't really speculate into it much. For those people who believe that there will be a physical Messiah, and different Jews have different beliefs, there are different kinds of Judaism. For those who believe in a personal or a physical Messiah, then they believe that the dead will rise again and they will take part in it also. There are a fair number of Jews these days who believe more that there will be a messianic age, and what that means is that we as humanity will figure out how to live well together, and that in itself will be a kind of a paradise. And so that is less inclusive of people who have passed away. So that's sort of how that works.
את ארפחשד 500 שנה ויולד בנים ובנות וארפחשד חי 35 שנה ויולד.
When we talk about sacred text, we start with the Tanakh. The Tanakh is made up of 3 parts, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. The Torah is the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Nevi'im are the prophets, and Ketuvim are the writings. And so what we have in the ark behind me are Torah, so just the 5 books. But when we talk about canon, when we talk about Bible, it's the entirety of the Tanakh. Now, that's not the end of sacred text. It's the end of what we would call the oral Torah, that which was some people consider divinely inspired on Sinai, and others think of as inspired by God and written by people. But following that, there's commentary, things like Midrash, which fills in sort of creatively the gaps in the Bible. There are things like Mishnah, which fill in questions of Jewish law. And then there's Talmud, which is commentary on that. And then continuing, there are codes and the idea of how we should live practically in the way that Jewish law functions. And all of those technically are considered written Torah and are considered sacred texts. So in a Torah scroll, you're going to find the 5 books of Moses. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And those are written in the original Hebrew, and each one of them is handwritten by a scribe. If there is a mistake, if a letter is broken, anything along those lines, the Torah becomes pasul. It's not kosher anymore until it's corrected. And so those 5 books get read multiple times a week in the Jewish tradition, and Jews around the world follow the same reading pattern. So we're all reading at the same part of the Torah. On Shabbat, on Saturdays, we also read from the Book of Prophets, and then on holidays we read from the writings. Depending on which holiday it is, there's a writing that corresponds to that holiday. So in that book behind me, it's just the 5 books, but there's a lot of text that we refer to pretty regularly. There is a Jewish calendar. It's a luni-solar calendar, so it's called an intercalation. So there's an intercalation. So the lunar calendar would make things move throughout the year the way that in the Muslim world Ramadan can move, and the solar calendar sort of keeps things fairly regularly. And so the Jewish calendar goes between the two, and based on the Jewish calendar that everybody in the Jewish world follows, for example, this coming weekend, we're going to read from a specific book of Genesis, and all the Jews around the world are reading that section of Genesis this week. Pre-70 of the Common Era, pre the destruction of the Roman Temple, there was a priesthood Jewishly. And those people didn't necessarily have religious authority so much as they were in charge of taking care of the temple and sacrifices. When the temple was destroyed in the year 70, Judaism changed fundamentally. We went from sacrificial religion, some people call it cult religion, to rabbinic Judaism, which is what most Jews, all Jews, practice today. And you'll recognize that there's a lot of upheaval in the religious world in that time period, right? That's not so different from the time where the disciples are writing about Jesus, when the New Testament is being written, that sort of piece of things. So there's a lot that's changing in the world at that time period about religion. So the Pharisees will end up being rabbinic Jews, right? They will end up being the people who say we need to go back to the text and understand Judaism through law, through text. The Sadducees then will have been the priesthood and the people who are running the temple. And in that particular time period, right, the Romans are in charge of what we think of as the land of Israel and Jerusalem. And it happens that the priesthood is really closely tied to the Roman rule at that time, and they end up being fairly corrupt in terms of what they're doing with the money and what they're doing with the leadership and the governance. And so I don't know that Jews necessarily would disagree with Jesus when he, is railing against moneylenders and the goings-on at the temple. But when the temple is destroyed in the year 70, the need for the priesthood isn't there. So those people either killed right, through the destruction of the temple. They were exiled to Babylonia, or they lost power. And so it's the Pharisees who really are the future of Judaism. They are the people who write the Mishnah and the Midrash. These are the sages who are going to come up with what Judaism is going to look like for the next 2 millennia by writing these texts that are commentaries on the Torah, so that Judaism becomes a text-based religion rather than a sacrificially based religion. So the authority that I have as a rabbi doesn't come from anything innate within me. I've done a certain period of study, and the rabbis before me have ordained me, have authorized that I know enough about Judaism and the Jewish custom and belief and practice to be able to be a rabbi. And so there isn't one central authority Jewishly, and there's no hierarchy. There are people who still keep track about whether their families were part of the priesthood or not, but they have no more authority necessarily than anyone else. So there are different branches of Judaism. There's Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist. Within the Reconstructionist, the Reform, and the Conservative world, there are it's a movement, and there are organizing principles. There's an organization that oversees. Having said that, no one gets to tell me as a rabbi that what I'm doing is or isn't okay, right? My congregation has a board, and I'm hired by that board, and I've given authority by my particular movement, which is the Reform movement. And the education that I'm given and that I continue to do in terms of my own study helps to stand me in good stead. And if I have questions that I don't know the answer to, I'll go to a rabbi who is wiser than I am, or that I trust his or her opinion. But nobody has the authority to ever say to me, you are no longer a rabbi. Having said that, I'm part of a rabbinic community that has an ethics committee, has an ethics committee, so that if, for example, a rabbi should do something that is improper to the role of being a rabbi, that committee can enforce a suspension or that sort of thing. But there isn't any one person or any one group that has full authority in the Jewish world. And ideally, even as a rabbi, I'm a guiding figure for my congregation. I'm a teacher. I would hope that each person in my congregation has his or her own relationship with the divine, his or her own relationship with the text, his or her own relationship to the community. And so Judaism, while very much a communal religion, is also made up of autonomous pieces. The rites of Judaism begin at 8 days old for a boy. That is the bris, or sometimes called the brit, depending on where in the world you're from. It's the ritual circumcision that enters a boy into the covenant. For girls, we do a naming. That's a more modern sort of a thing, and it usually happens sometime between when the girl is born and when she's, 2-3 years old, anytime along that time. And that starts with Abraham, with God's command to enter boys into the covenant. And it's really powerful. You start at 8 days, and to tell you that a mother, 8 days after the birth of a son, has all of the hormones still going, and this idea that she's willing to let her son be circumcised for her faith is a really big deal. And for fathers, this idea that their son is following in his footsteps is also a big deal. And I like to remind people in the community that the people who are in attendance for the mitzvah, because it is a commandment, have a kind of a responsibility to that child and the family, and seeing them grow up and be members of the community. The next step is consecration, which is the formal welcoming of our students, our little boys and girls, into their Jewish education. And so in kindergarten, first grade, we bring them on Simchat Torah, which is the holiday where we celebrate the end of the Torah and the beginning of the reading of the scroll again. And we welcome our students, and we dance with them, and we dance with the Torah. And there's a very old tradition, which is that there's a piece of parchment or paper. We tend to do it with sugar cookies here, and there are Hebrew letters on it. We make our sugar cookies into the shape of those Hebrew letters, and traditionally a little bit of honey is put on that paper, and the idea is that the words of Torah should always be sweet to the children. And so there's a ceremony around that, and often, at least in America, kids will get this little paper Torah that they can dance with that's their own, so that they really feel like the Torah belongs to them. And the next step is bar or bat mitzvah. So when a boy becomes 13, when a girl becomes 12 or 13, depending on the community, they do all of this training. They learn to read Hebrew, they learn to chant, they learn the service. Fundamentally, they learn to lead the community in prayer. And it's a welcoming into the covenant in a different way. Up until this time, their parents have been responsible for the way that they practice Judaism. When a young man or woman turns 13, they become responsible for their own commitment to the commandments. And so, at least from a liberally Jewish point of view perspective, they are deciding how they're going to relate to mitzvot and commandments and to their Judaism. An American sort of custom that came out of that was that there were a number of people who said, 13 isn't really old enough to make that kind of commitment. And so out of that was born something called confirmation, which happens sophomore year of high school, and the kids do more study and they really devote themselves to their Judaism. At our congregation, the way that we work with them is we send them to DC to talk to their legislators based on their convictions and what they've learned about Jewish values and how those should apply to the world. God willing, they will find people they love in life, and the next step will be their wedding. We get married under a chuppah, a marriage canopy, and there are 7 blessings, and there's a whole lot of things that are related to it, but that is the next sort of life marker. And then fundamentally, the idea is that after you get married, your children's life markers become your own until one day we all pass away, and there is a Jewish way of marking death also. And so funerals are also a way of communicating that someone lived a Jewish life and remains part of our community through memory, if no longer through their life. It's a funny question to be asking a woman rabbi, but the way that women and men relate to Judaism has changed substantially over time for some Jews and not for all Jews. So again, this is a question about the spectrum of Jewish practice. There are some, for example, in the Reform movement, and for some in the conservative movement and in the Reconstructionist movement, the role of women and men is the same at this point, right? We all have responsibilities to teach our children to pray and to study, and we can be rabbis and all of those things. In the Orthodox world, it's a lot different in that for positive time-bound commandments, most of them, men are obligated, and there are only specific ones to which women are obligated. They're all men and women are obligated to negative commandments and positive time-bound commandments. So I mean, for example, you're commanded to pray 3 times a day. The understanding is that a woman, for the most part, will be a homemaker, and that her children are going to run her timing more than Torah does. And the way that it's understood is that because it's an obligation upon men, if through a woman practicing, somehow that obligation that the man has is deferred, then he has lost an opportunity to fulfill a commandment. And therefore, there's almost an understanding that women oughtn't or ought to do it in a different way, so that in an Orthodox synagogue, men and women are separated, so that the men shouldn't be distracted from the commandments that they're obligated to, but women aren't. And that's not to say that women can't do them, but because they're not obligated, it's a different level of urgency, potentially. Having said that, even in the Orthodox world, there is a lot of variation from modern Orthodox to ultra-Orthodox, so that I've been to Orthodox communities where the mechitza, the separation between men and women, is lace and shoulder height, and I've been to them where women sit in the very back of the room, or there's a full wall, and there's just new interaction between the men and the women. So there's a pretty large spectrum of practice Jewishly between what men and women do or don't do. The stereotypical rabbi is not only a man, but he's big, well, actually depends, right? So sometimes he's very scrawny because he reads Torah all the time, and sometimes he's big, he's got a beard, and he's got payas, and he's wearing his kippah, and that is a very specific type of Orthodox male rabbi. In the Reform, Reconstructionist, and Conservative movements, women have been ordained. The Reform movement began, I want to say, in the 70s, although it may have been the late 60s. Sally Priesand was the first woman rabbi ordained. And by the time I was ordained in 2007, half of my class was female, and the class after mine was majority woman, although there's some interesting pushback against that also. Does it change the respect that a rabbi gets if it's a woman? Are all congregations ready for female clergy? And so there's a lot of conversation around it still. But it's a fairly common thing at this point, at least in those movements. In the Orthodox world, I know of one Orthodox rabbi who is ordaining women, and it's a very rare occurrence, and I'm pretty sure that she still has a non-egalitarian congregation if she serves in that capacity at all. So it depends what kind of Jews you're talking about. I think it's a complicated question how Jews see people of other faiths or see other religions, because even within Judaism there is so much, well, this is the right way to do it, or you should do it this way, or I do it this way, but you can do it that way, and there's a lot of different interpretation that's involved. And so there's an Orthodox rabbi in town, and despite the fact that I'm a strong feminist figure, I actually am very appreciative of the idea that he's willing to refer to me as rabbi, because there are other male rabbis who are Orthodox who might not. So even within Judaism, there's a lot of ongoing conversation, maybe even strain around this idea of who is a Jew and what does it mean to be Jewish. Having said that, because Judaism isn't based around salvation, it's not important to us that other people necessarily be Jewish. There are different ways of reaching God, of reaching spirituality. And Jews definitely think that this is the right way for us. That doesn't make it the right way for everybody else. Having said that, historically, Judaism is less comfortable with religions that may have a multiplicity of godheads rather than monotheistic faiths. And I think the Jews in the modern world are very used to, Christians and Muslims and all of these different ways of approaching God, certainly through Abrahamic faiths. Having said that, I don't have any issues with Christians or Muslims. Occasionally, I get a little frustrated when they don't realize where their faith comes from, or that, Jesus was Jewish, which is kind of a surprise to some people. But what's valuable to me, and I get this wonderful opportunity, I have a lot of people from Christian backgrounds especially who come and they say, would you explain, and they'll call it the Old Testament, which it isn't for Jews because we don't have a New Testament, but Hebrew scriptures, would you come talk through the beginnings of Christianity with us? And that's an amazing opportunity for dialogue and for ways that we understand each other better. There are some prayers that talk about, right, we talked about a messianic time or a Messiah coming, and there is some notion that when that happens, everyone will be Jewish. But at least the form of Judaism that I practice, that's not something that's emphasized. It's not something that's, we go around thinking, yay, everyone's going to be Jewish. Fundamentally, I think what we want is that everybody will find a way to be at peace and loving one another, and that what their religion is, however they get to that path, it's a good place to be. So for many faiths, ascribing to certain principles, accepting someone as your Lord and Savior, as a Messiah figure, that sort of thing, affords you salvation, that your soul will therefore then go to heaven, or you will be saved or not damned. Because Judaism focuses on this world so much more than a world to come, what Judaism is about is how do we partner with God and with divine concepts to make this world the best world that it can be. We're not practicing Judaism because we are concerned about our soul. We practice Judaism because we think that it's the best way to be part of a humanity in the current world. And so we're not necessarily interested in salvation. And I mean, the other piece for people who are coming from an LDS background, it's a non-doctrinal faith, right? So while we may all agree that there is one God, beyond that, everything is open for interpretation. And so nobody gets to tell you what to think or what to believe because there's not a hierarchy. And so we can all say, yes, we agree on the 10 Commandments. And for some Jews, that's because God has, given us the 10 Commandments. And for other Jews, it's because if we believe that we are part of a larger community of people in the world, then in order to survive well, we need a social contract that's based on these laws. It's not that anybody else gets to enforce it for us, though. I think that Jews, as a rule, always have somebody who they think is doing it wrong. Okay, like there are jokes, right? That when you're on a Jew on a desert island gets stranded, he has to build 2 synagogues, one that's his and one that he wouldn't step foot in, right? Because they don't do it the right way. And I say it sort of laughingly, it's a much bigger issue in Israel than it is in the United States. I'm the rabbi of a dual-affiliated congregation. We are both Reform and conservative. If I weren't the rabbi of a dual-affiliated congregation, I probably would be much stronger in my stance. I'm a Reform Jew, and there's a reason I'm a Reform Jew. I believe in it. There are certain choices that I think are important for individuals to make. Having said that, I've been the rabbi here for 5 years, and so it's important for me that different kinds of Jews, the different streams of Judaism relate to each other. And so there are different ways of referring to those groups. We very much don't call them sects. Right? Judaism has streams, the idea being that we all come from the same body of water, or we have branches and we all branch from the same tree. It's really a question of interpretation and a question of how you understand commandedness to be. It's about belief. And so for an Orthodox Jew, I'm doing it wrong. It's okay, I think he's doing it wrong too. But fundamentally, we're Jews as far as I'm concerned. That's not always the response that you will get. And in places like Israel, there's a really intense battle that goes on. And it's not violence, right? But there's a lot of very strong disagreement and people who think that there is a right way and a wrong way to do Judaism. What I battle more than that is the number of people who come to me and say, I'm a bad Jew. And I say, there's no such thing as a bad Jew, so tell me how you would like to be Jewish. Because someone has somehow told them that what they're doing is wrong, or has convinced them that their way isn't authentic. I find that problematic. I think that if you want people to believe in something and to be a part of their faith, then they need to feel good about where they are, and they can continue to learn. We can all continue to learn. I don't think there's a right way to do Judaism. And don't worry, there are a lot of Jews who will disagree with me on that and will tell you that I'm completely wrong. So that's how that works. A lot of people think that Judaism is like the oldest religion, and it's not, right? The Hindus go back further than we do. But the thing that made us different from the beginning was monotheism, and the idea that there is one God. And there are religions that, that have arrived in the world post-Judaism that have adopted monotheism, but in a different way than Judaism does to a certain degree. Christianity certainly thinks of the Godhead as having different aspects, or as the Trinity, that sort of thing. And Judaism, I think, really sticks to ethical monotheism, that we are ethical because we believe in one God, and our relationship with that one God urges us to behave in a certain way. And beyond that, so there are a couple of things that I want to get to. One is that Judaism as a religion can't be separated from Judaism and its history. So when we talk about Judaism, often we end up talking about a lachrymose history, right? A sorrowful history where we're exiled from the land of Israel, or get expelled from Spain. We get expelled from a lot of places, or we talk about Nazi Germany. And the evolution of Judaism is very much tied into the historical happenings in the world. And the way that Judaism is practiced today is very much in the context of the history that we've had. And while I think that's true of other religions, I think that Judaism is very self-conscious about it, so that we have holidays and commemorations that mark historical events. So I think that's one other thing that makes Judaism slightly different. And I would argue that the third thing that makes Judaism different is that we're tied to a land. There are a lot of people that ask, why is the place of Israel so important? But there's a biblical historicity, and it takes place in one particular area of the world. So that there is a birthday of the trees that we celebrate in the winter. And in North America, it makes no sense to celebrate the birthday of the trees in the winter. Everything is barren, everything is dead. And there's a real beauty to that, because you celebrate something even when you can't see it in its fully vibrant state. But in Israel, where there are orange trees, the orchards in January are just starting to come too. When we celebrate the rainy season in Sukkot, we're not celebrating the rainy season in Utah, we're celebrating the rainy season in Israel. And fundamentally, the way that we practice and the way that we believed is tied into the place that is Israel. And I lied, there's another thing that I want to talk about that makes it just slightly different, which is that it's not based on a revelation to any one person. Right? Judaism is about a community of people receiving revelation. So at Mount Sinai, it wasn't Moses, it was the people of Israel. And so there is never just one witness or one person that vouches for faith. It's the entirety of the community. So I would say that those four things really make Judaism unique.